Hi, I'm Captain Mission. Stewardship is rooted in trust. Dr. Steve Currow brings clarity to systematic giving and what it means to return to the storehouse today.
One aspect of stewardship is money and assets. And usually there are two components to this discussion. One is about tithe, the other one is about offerings. But that's really why we're living. I also want to suggest, before I get into discussions about tithing and offerings, that we ought to be stewards of our money and assets in death. And this is why it's important to also think, as responsible stewards of what God has given us, that we should always have a will. And the Trust Services Department of the Church is able to help us with that. So let's come back to tithe. What is tithe? Well, tithe is a 10% figure on our income. It really is about 10% of our increase. Now, many of us are salaried employees. That's much easier to work with, and we think about 10% of our gross before any expenditure comes out, like taxes, national insurance, and things like that. If we're thinking of this as a business, it's obviously 10% of the profit. What has been taken, less expenses that have been incurred making that money. And we could have a much more definitive definition of tithe, but we'll leave that for a later discussion. The second question I'd like to ask is, whose money is the tithe? I would suggest to you that as you read Malachi chapter 3, we get a very clear message that this is God's money. And really, returning tithe is our acknowledgement of God's lordship. If you like, it could be expressed as it's us returning rent for the life He has given to us. Where does the tithe belong? Malachi 3 again comes back and makes a very clear point. The tithe needs to be brought to the storehouse. In those days, that was the temple. In these days, it's the conference. When should tithe be returned? Well, I would suggest the time to return it is when you actually calculate your increase. So many of us in the UK are on a monthly salary. I would expect tithe would normally be returned every month. But then again, you've got some business entrepreneurs that might get paid or pay themselves quarterly or every 6 months. They would return then. On other fronts, you may have some self-employed people that might get paid, or pay themselves once a week or once a fortnight. Whatever the period of increase is the easiest time to think about when to return the tithe. One question that often comes up is, how should tithe be used? When we go back to the Old Testament priesthood, it was very clear that the tithe was there to support the work of the Levites. Unlike the other 11 tribes, the Levites did not own land, and they were not able to support themselves because they didn't have land. They relied on the tithe of the other 11 tribes being brought to the temple. And again, it's a similar principle. We find in Luke chapter 10, that Luke says, quoting Jesus, a labourer is worthy of their hire. We can look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 8, where Paul talks about the way in which he had been supported by another church, but was using this opportunity to evangelise in a different community. A principle of shared responsibility coming with the tithe. Shared for mission. And it's interesting, as you read some of the early Adventist times, you have discussions there of the presidents coming together and being able to say, well, we've got this much surplus tithe to be able to spend in mission. Interestingly, my great-great-uncle, the first Australian Adventist missionary in Fiji, was actually supported by the North Pacific Conference because they had committed to send a missionary there but were unable to get the right person, so they still sent them money. It's also interesting to notice that in 3 John, verses 5 to 8, there is a reference here to supporting such people, those that were working for the church in missionary, ministry and evangelism. Be fellow workers that should be supported. Naturally, there comes a question here about what is my responsibility. Am I the one to judge whether it is being spent well or not spent well? Am I the one to judge whether this is a worthy cause or that is a worthy cause? In terms of causes, that's the opportunity for offerings, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But I would suggest to you that my responsibility, like anything, as a disciple of Jesus, is to be faithful in what I need to do, in what I'm called to do. And I believe this is true in my financial relationship with God. Because if it's God's money, it's really up for God to determine how that should be used. But if I start making those decisions, I'm actually trying to say it's my money and I'm going to make decisions on behalf of God. It's very clear that when we read Malachi 3, verses 5 to 8, God is saying through the prophet Malachi that if we withhold tithe, if we forget to tithe, we are actually robbing God. Not the church, not the ministry, not the priesthood. And yet we also need to hold administration, whether it's local church, conference, or union, or general conference, to account for the way they spend tithe. And this can be done in business meetings with financial statements and bank reconciliations. It can be done with internal auditing, external audit reports. It can be done through delegated authority where executive committees do this. It can be done in session reports and questions. But my responsibility always is to be faithful. So what happens if I don't tithe? Well, Malachi 3:10 says very clearly, I'm the one missing out on the blessing. You see, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills and the wealth in every mine. Psalms 50 tells us that. God has all the resources he needs. The one that is missing out is the giver who has not given, the tither who has not tithed. And as you read research, you'll find so many people talk about the blessings of tithing, the miracle of how 90% of our income goes further than 100%. Well, before I go into offerings, I want to suggest to you that there has been some tithing research done in the South England Conference. It was part of a global initiative funded by the Archive Statistics and Research at General Conference. My colleague, Dr. Robert McIver from Avondale University, was the key researcher on this particular project. But it was a project I had worked with him on in Australia a number of years before. It's worth reading it. It's been published in 2016 in conjunction with Archive Statistics and Research at General Conference and Avondale Academic Press. I'd be more than happy to send you a link and to provide a copy. But let's now talk about offerings. Offerings are much more for gifts for incidental expenses. In the local church, They may be part of ministry activities. They may be part of the purchase of the building, the maintenance of the building, the payment of utilities, the provision of other services to members of the community. In the local church or conference or mission, it may be dealing with a range of other operational activities. Tithe is typically restricted to the employment of ministers and the support of evangelism, with some of that evangelism being recognised as happening within some of our institutions, like schools, where you see young people make decisions for Jesus. Tithe is also there and can be used, offerings are also there and can be used for global projects. My giving is like a response to God's goodness. And I think it's important for us to think about the various things where we can spend money on our offerings. We've got 13 Sabbath projects. We've got the support of missionaries. We've got all the global initiatives being done. We've also got the local activities. What are we doing with it in our church? How are we actually preparing our church for worship? How are we witnessing in some of the community in the service projects that we do? They may not have a direct evangelistic impact. So offerings are an important part. They're a voluntary part. They're part of our response. Whereas tithe is coming back to the fact that this is God's money that we're returning for His service, for the support of ministry and evangelism wherever we go. I mentioned earlier the concept of the shared responsibility. One of the things that became very obvious to my colleague Ron McIver and I when we started doing some of this tithing research is that the most strategic decision the church ever made was to pool tithe. Because it's the pooling of that tithe that enables mission to grow wherever we have congregations. We don't have the pastor of the largest church getting the largest salary and the pastor of the smallest company getting the smallest one. We have a pooled tithe that is shared to support the global mission of the church. Think about that strategy. Other groups that emerge from the Great Disappointment may have introduced tithing, but they didn't introduce that shared concept or that global mission concept. And that's very important for each one of us. In conclusion, I want to come back to a couple of texts that I love. The first one is Proverbs 3, verses 9 and 10. Honour the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. 2 Corinthians 9:11, in one translation, makes it clear, God will always make you and I rich enough to be generous on every occasion. When we're talking about the stewardship of money, whether we're talking about tithe, where we're called to be faithful with our financial responsibilities and our obligations, when we're talking about offerings, when these are voluntary giving, and this is for things that can continue the life and ministry of the church in areas that are not directly connected to evangelism, you and I are called to be faithful and called to be generous, knowing that God will bless the generosity of each one of us.